This lecture is going to be on different kinds of arguments and their forms. If I ask you the question, what is an argument? What comes to mind? Is it maybe a heated argument that you had with a parent or a family member or a friend? Maybe, you thought that you had something your way and they thought that they had it their way, and so you disagreed over something? Well, that's sort of a kind of argument. That's the kind of argument that we normally think of when we're talking about people arguing with one another. But it's not really what an argument is. The core sort of underlying idea of an argument is much broader. There's more kinds of things that count as arguments, even if there's no sort of emotional heat involved. That being said, heated arguments are arguments, but that leads us to think like if there's a larger category of arguments, we want to be able to classify them in different ways. We want to have a sort of theory of the different kinds of arguments that there are and the different ways to think about them, the different types. Here's a sort of set of a sample set of a bunch of different kinds of arguments that you might confront, right? Suppose a teen wants to stay out past their curfew, but their dad says no, right? Donald Trump claims that there was election voter fraud, but an investigation claims otherwise. A scientist tries to falsify a theory by showing that their results don't allow for its possibility. A student might try to get their grade improved by appealing to how sick they were during the quarter. Not a very good idea. Or a politician could claim that pharmaceutical companies need to pay more in taxes to offset the opioid crisis that they helped start. All of these are different kinds of situations that will have a sort of argument behind them. Some of them are heated, but not all of them. Now, the question that we want to ask and try to answer in a class like this where we're discussing arguments is what each of these kinds of arguments has in common. And what is it in these kinds of, situations or conversations or whatever they are, written pieces of work? What is it that makes each of these things an argument, as to say like a discussion or something else, right? A poem or song, right? What's the difference? Like what makes something an argument versus just a statement or something else like that? And at the very least, what we need to do in order to start thinking about these things is kind of set apart what all of the aspects are of each of these kinds of arguments, and then look at those generally and see what each of them has in common. So in each scenario that we just discussed, what is going on? Well, there's going to be a sort of set of claims, right? So take the politician arguing about the pharmaceutical companies needing to pay more in taxes. Well, there's going to be a set of claims, right? Like, look, the politician's going to say the pharmaceutical companies were part and parcel to the opioid crisis. The pharmaceutical companies only pay this much in taxes. That nowhere near covers the cost for the opioid crisis. Therefore, the pharmaceutical companies ought to pay more in taxes. Now, each of those statements was just a sentence after sentence after sentence. Those were all claims, right? And each of those together, create the whole argument. So there's a bunch of claims in an argument. Now, there's, of course, something that different parties are going to disagree over, right? So the pharmaceutical companies definitely don't think that they need to pay more in taxes, probably. Whereas certain government elected officials probably do. Definitely, I think that they ought to, right? So there's a disagreement. There's something to be disagreed over in this situation. And then there's, something that someone wants in this case, right? Like somebody wants to, wants everyone else to agree with them. That's why they're making the argument. Or wants everyone else to recognize the truth of the claim that, say, the pharmaceutical companies aren't paying their fair share. Now, we can distinguish two different parts of an argument, and that'll help us to categorize and classify arguments moving forward. The two sort of different aspects, the two different parts, really, of every argument are going to be, at first, the claim that's being made to be argued for, right? We call this the conclusion of the argument. Whenever you come across an argument, there's going to be something, even sometimes it's unstated, there's something that the person that giving the argument is trying to get you to believe or to take as true, right? And whatever that is, that's ultimately going to be the conclusion of the argument. There's something that they're trying to get you to accept. Now, the other part of the argument is going to be all of the supporting details, the supporting bits of information, what we call the premises of the argument. The premises of the argument are the reasons or the justifications that the arguer has for believing the claim that they're trying to get you to believe, the conclusion, right? So there's the conclusion, which is the thing they're trying to get you to believe, and the premises, which are the reasons that they have for getting you to believe the conclusion. So now we have two things that we can use to start classifying arguments. We can classify arguments by appealing to the kinds of conclusions that they have, and we can classify arguments by appealing to the kinds of premises that they have. In fact, we can even classify arguments by appealing to sort of both at the same time and say the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. If there's a special relationship in some kinds of arguments as opposed to others, then we can classify arguments along those lines. Now, there's lots of ways that you could do this, right? There's lots of ways that you could classify arguments using the premises and the conclusions, right? You could classify arguments by appealing to their subject matter, right? You could like have political arguments over here, moral arguments over here, epistemological arguments, that's arguments that have to do with whether or not you know something, over there, arguments of science over here, etc. You could also classify arguments by means of their adherence, right? So any argument that the conclusion is that cows can jump over the moon, you might not have very many people adhere to that argument because it's just not very believable, right? Whereas arguments like, well, we might have more interesting arguments, say political arguments over whether or not you should believe in trickle-down economics or something, or arguments over the abortion debate, where one side of the argument has a certain number of people that adhere to it, whereas the other side of the argument have a different number of people that adhere to it. We could, of course, classify arguments by way of whether or not more people believe in them than don't. We can also classify arguments by their level of importance, right? Which arguments are more important to you? Which arguments mean more to you? What things are, like, how much difference would an argument, if true, actually make in your life? Or, putting all of these other, interesting ways to classify arguments aside, we could do what logicians and philosophers have tended to do, which is to focus on the two main things that are like the focus, the function of arguments. The two things that arguments are used for, the main aspect of an argument. And those two things are persuasiveness, that arguments get used to try and persuade people, and truth. Arguments get used to try and establish truths. The idea here is, I think, pretty straightforward. Arguments serve a kind of function in our everyday lives, just like any other good kind of tool, right? Like cars serve the function of transportation. Knives serve the function of cutting things. Computers serve the function of information, being able to transfer information, being able to store information. Arguments are used to serve certain functions, right? And there are the two things that arguments tend to be used for are showing that a particular claim is true, like establishing it, right? You say the claim and then you say, look, here's all the evidence, and this establishes that the claim is true. Or makes it extremely probable, right, that the claim is true. Or you have different kinds of arguments, right, like more like the arguments that you tend to have with your parents, where the point of the argument is not as much to establish something's true, but as to persuade someone to believe something, right? I mean, both of these are ultimately aimed at truth in some way, but on the one hand, you've got things like scientific arguments, philosophical arguments that tend to be more focused on, just laying out what's true and what's not true. Whereas the kinds of arguments that we tend to have in our everyday lives tend to be more based on whether or not we're trying to persuade someone to think a certain way, act a certain way, do a certain thing. Now, for each of these functions, we can ultimately then classify arguments by how good they are at achieving their goals, right? So we could classify arguments by, in terms of their truth, and whether or not, a good argument would be a true one, right? A correct one. And we can classify arguments in terms of their ability to persuade. So a good argument there would be an actually persuasive one. Here's a little chart that I made to sort of give you an idea. Different arguments, we're going to classify them in terms of their truth and in terms of their persuasiveness. When it comes to thinking about arguments and truth, we're going to talk about deductive arguments, which have the features of validity and soundness. And we're going to talk about inductive arguments, which have the features of strength and cogency. And then when we talk about different levels of persuasiveness, there's a difference between good arguments that are persuasive and bad arguments that are unpersuasive. Where the good arguments are persuasive, we need to think about what it is that they ask us to believe and whether or not we ultimately do believe them when they're persuasive, and what credence we're ultimately going to take in their claims. Or when it comes to bad arguments, we need to we want to be able to recognize when an argument is bad and unpersuasive ultimately. And many or most of the time that an argument is bad is the reason is because it commits some kind of fallacy. When talking about arguments, arguments tend to have a special relation to truth, or the truth, or whatever we call truth, or the facts. When you're giving an argument, usually what you're trying to do, unless you're doing it sort of insincerely, is trying to claim that a conclusion is true, and then usually you're trying to get somebody to accept that as well. And then the premises that you offer basically support that the conclusion is true. That's what you're trying to do, right? You're claiming that this conclusion is true and offering reasons to believe it, where those premises are also supposedly going to be true, and then on the basis of the truth of the premises, you think that the conclusion is true. But there's lots of different ways that an argument can ultimately be related to the truth, right? So if you know the truth, right, if you know that something is true, you might be using an argument to show somebody else that the truth that you already know is something that, that they should accept. You might be using the truth of the argument to persuade them, right? You're like, well, look, here's this conclusion that I think is true, and here are these premises. And you already accept these premises, right? And because you accept these premises, and these premises lead to this conclusion, you should also accept this conclusion. You might also, though, use an argument in a case in which you don't know the truth already. But what you're doing is you're trying to set up sort of this conclusion to see if it's true. And what you're doing then is taking the premises, which you think are true, and sort of checking to see if the premises actually support the conclusion. So you're checking to see if these true premises actually do support the conclusion and make the conclusion, make it plausible that the conclusion itself is true. Here's an example, right? Suppose you know that whales are mammals, not fish, but you're trying to convince someone, right? You're trying to convince, say, your 8-year-old nephew. And you tell them, look, you know what mammals are, right? Like your nephew thinks, oh, whales are fish or something like that because they live in the ocean. You say, look, you know what mammals are, right? They're these creatures that are warm-blooded, and they give birth to live young instead of laying eggs or whatever. Well, that's the first premise, right? And then hopefully your nephew accepts that. And then you say, well, guess what? Whales are also warm-blooded, and they also give birth to live young. And so if that's the case, and fish ultimately don't, right? So there aren't any fish that are warm. Maybe there are warm-blooded fish. I'm not really sure about that, but I don't think that there are any fish that give birth to live young. And so you could say, look, because of these two features, it seems that whales are mammals. And in this kind of case, right, you're using the argument, you're assuming, you already know the truth of the conclusion, and then you're trying to take the premises, you're trying to take the truth of the premises that is already accepted by someone, and then you're leading them down the path using the truth of the premises to get them to accept the conclusion as well. And here's an example of the other sort of case, right, when you're trying to find the truth for yourself. Suppose, you're studying math and you hear someone say, oh, look, there's no such thing as the largest number. And you're thinking like, wait a minute, but there's a smallest number, so doesn't it make sense if there's a smallest number that there would be a largest number? Well, you can sort of look at this argument and determine for yourself, right? The smallest number is 0, sure, that seems right? It's the lowest cardinality that you could possibly have, none, right? That's premise 1. And then premise 2 here, for any number, you can always add 1 to it. So there is no largest number, right? Well, you can just kind of try and think through that for yourself. And if you think through it for yourself and you're like, well, okay, premise 1 is true. Premise 2, yeah, that seems true. And what does that mean? Well, that means for any number that I could possibly think up, I could always add another 1 to it, which would make it bigger, which would be a bigger number. And so I guess, yeah, it can't be the case that there's a largest number. And in this case, right, the idea is that the truth is sort of out there, and the conclusion is something that you're, checking to see if it's true. And the conclusion follows from the premises, and the premises you accept to be true. And so you use the argument to convince yourself in a way, and establish that the conclusion is true. Now, when you use an argument to try and establish what's true and from what's not true, there are different modes or different ways of going about it. And not all arguments are actually able to establish what's true in a way that's like absolutely certain, right? Where some arguments are able, and we'll talk about this more, to show without a shadow of a doubt that if certain premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Whereas other kinds of arguments only show that certain conclusions are more probable than not. So some kinds of arguments, you might accept the truth of the premises, and the conclusions might be more probable than improbable, but it could still, the argument could fail to ultimately establish beyond any doubt the truth of the conclusion. So some arguments in the end are ultimately just, they're very persuasive, but they're really just establishing that something is more probable than not. And this is often what happens in scientific arguments, right? So in the past, science has been wrong. People thought that there was this thing out there in the world called the ether, right? And that they had to use this thing in order to explain lots of things, like how fire worked, and they thought that maybe like souls existed in the ether. But at some point, science has overturned that way of thinking, that set of arguments. And so science has moved on. Well, ultimately, whatever arguments were being used to argue for things like the ether, or that the planet Earth was at the center of the solar system, or at the center of the universe, they got overturned because the arguments weren't actually good enough to fully establish the truth of their conclusions. Similarly, quite often, evidence that we gather that supports certain conclusions is imperfect. And when we gather certain evidence and it's not perfect, then what looks like a good argument, where one of the premises supports the conclusion, turns out, maybe it is a good argument if the premise were true, but it turns out that the premise is not true because the premise is based on imperfect, faulty evidence. Now, with this relationship to the truth in mind, we can distinguish between two types of arguments. We can distinguish the kinds of arguments that guarantee the truth versus the kinds of arguments that suggest the truth or make things more probable than not. Now, the kinds of arguments that are in the business of guaranteeing the truth are called deductive arguments. They are the kinds of arguments that allow you to deduce the conclusion, where deduction is the kind of thing that's such that, like, if you've got true premises, then the conclusion must also be true. It's guaranteed to be true. In this kind of argument, a deductive argument, we call them truth-preserving arguments, because the idea is that if the premises are true, then truth is preserved from the premises to the conclusion. It's guaranteed in some way. On the other hand, and more often than not, the kinds of arguments that you will see, especially in science or everyday writing, we've got inductive arguments. Inductive arguments, when they're good, have conclusions that are probably true, and that's generally what's going on. We've got evidence, and the evidence supports the conclusion, and the argument can be a strong argument in the way that the evidence really does make the conclusion more probable than not, but the evidence itself doesn't actually say, hey, this conclusion couldn't possibly be wrong, right? The evidence could be correct, right? You could have true premises, but it could somehow still be the case that the conclusion fails to be true. Here's some examples. So this is an example of a deductive argument. More often than not, deductive arguments are extremely boring, very straightforward. There are some more complicated ones, which we'll talk about, but just so straightforward, right? Take this example. All men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates was a man. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates was mortal. Now, this actually, as it's laid out here, sort of premise 1, premise 2, conclusion, is what we call standard argument form. If you're going to use anything writing out arguments yourself, I highly recommend that you try to do it this way. You take the conclusion, you put it at the end, and then you put the premises, the reasons for believing the conclusion before it. Ultimately, though, in this deductive argument, you've got the two premises and the conclusion follows from the two premises. Now, in deductive arguments, there's a special kind of relation that holds between the premises and the conclusion. And this relation we call validity. A good deductive argument, and this is something that you need to know, you need to memorize basically. A good deductive argument is a valid argument, and a bad deductive argument is one that is invalid. Now, what exactly is validity? Well, a valid argument, an argument's valid, just in case the premises, if true, actually guarantee the conclusion. Remember that. So a valid argument is an argument is valid just in case the premises, if true, on the assumption that the premises are true, they guarantee that the conclusion is also true. Here's another example. So remember, deductive argument is valid if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. So here the example: if Felix is a cat, then Felix is a mammal, right? That seems true, right? Because all cats are mammals. And Felix is a cat. Now, think about those first two premises. If they are both true, what has to follow? Well, the conclusion, right? So Felix is a mammal. We might even suppose that Felix isn't a cat, right? Suppose we're talking about Felix the dog or something like that. Well, even in that case, this argument is still valid. Why? Well, because validity doesn't care whether or not the premises are actually true. Validity is a property of arguments, whether or not the arguments are ultimately correct. Validity is the kind of property of an argument that just cares about the relationship between the premises and the conclusion, whether or not any of them are true or false. It cares about whether or not, if the premises are assumed to be true, then the conclusion has to follow, right? And so you can kind of see, right? Even if Felix isn't a cat, so that would make premise 2 false. It's still the case that if Felix is a cat, right? If Felix were to be a cat, then Felix would be a mammal, right? Suppose Felix is a fish, so premise 2 is false. Well, it's still true that if Felix was to be a cat, then Felix would be a mammal. And if Felix were a cat, right, then yeah, Felix would be a mammal. So the argument would still go through in the sense that it would be true if we assumed that the premises were correct. But even if the premises aren't correct, the argument is still good in this sense, right? It's valid. It's still, in a way, a correct form of argument. The other feature, or sort of the further feature of deductive arguments, is their soundness. And ultimately, this is what needs to get added to sort of, understand what it is to have a really good argument. So deductive arguments can be valid, like I was just saying, without ultimately being correct, right? A deductive argument could ultimately be false. It could have a false conclusion because one of the premises is false, even while the argument is still valid. That is, that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true, right? When an argument is valid, it has the sort of right structure of a deductive argument. But even under the correct structure, an argument could still fail, right? Now, if an argument is valid and it has the correct structure and it has true premises, like actually true, not just assumed to be true, it actually has true premises. The premises of the argument are real facts out in the world. Then the argument is said to be sound. A sound argument is ultimately the best kind of argument because it is both valid and it has true premises. And what that means, ultimately, because validity is this idea that, if an argument is valid, then if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. And we now know that if the argument is sound, that the premises are true. Well, then what's going to follow from that? Well, it's got to be that the conclusion is ultimately true. So a sound argument is really the best possible kind of argument you could have because it is both valid and the premises are true, ultimately meaning that the conclusion itself is also true. So now we've gone down this one path from arguments to truth and learned about two features of deductive arguments, that basically what validity is and what it is for an argument to be sound. Now we can move on to inductive arguments, which are really much more common than deductive arguments. Deductive arguments are kind of the gold standard, and really they're used quite often in things like math and philosophy, but inductive arguments are more often the kind of argument that you see in science, the kind of argument that you see in the newspaper, the kind of argument that you see being made by a politician. Inductive arguments involve ultimately claiming that something is probably true, right? An inductive argument, you take some evidence and you say, look, this evidence supports this conclusion, but usually the evidence is, less than perfect, and the conclusion is supported by the evidence, but not sort of shown so obviously to be true. Inductive arguments do not guarantee their conclusions, even if the premises are true. So it's always possible in an inductive argument that the premises are true, but the conclusion is not. And yeah, inductive arguments are usually what's going on when we're using or following the scientific method and when we're making claims based on data or evidence that we've gathered. So here's a really simple inductive argument, right? And this is actually something that happened, a few hundred years ago in the UK, right? A bunch of scientists, like biologists, they're walking around England and the UK, and they're ornithologists. They're checking out all the birds, and all of the swans that they've ever seen really out there are white, right? They search out all the swans, right? They're just keep looking around, looking at swans. So we can say this argument, right? This ornithologist has seen 1,000 swans, and every swan that he's ever seen has been white. He's never seen a swan that's other than white. Well, if that's correct, if both of those premises are true, then what is this guy justified in ultimately concluding? Well, something that he seems at least initially justified in is thinking that the next time he sees a swan, that swan is going to be a white one, right? Is that guaranteed, right? Definitely not, right? Somebody could have painted the swan pink or something like that, but it seems more likely than not, right? And because he's seen 1,000 white swans, and he's never seen a swan that wasn't white, well, yeah, like it seems like he's justified in believing that the next swan he's going to see is also going to be a white one. Going further than that, right? If you think, well, okay, yeah, the next swan I see is probably going to be white, and then you just think like further on, right? The next 10 swans I see are probably going to be white. The next 100 swans I see are probably going to be right. That seems right. Well, maybe it's just true that all swans are white, right? Well, that could be. It could also be, and it also does seem as if seeing a ridiculous number of swans where all of them are white is good evidence for believing that ultimately all of them are white. But it'd be pretty hard to go out and actually like see all the swans, right? For like one person or for even one group of scientists, because you'd never know if there was a swan like hiding in the middle of some lake somewhere, and you just weren't able to actually check to see if it was white. So it doesn't guarantee the conclusion, but it does seem like it's got good support. The problem with the argument, of course, is that there are black swans. They live in Australia. So on this argument, right, the premises, they do support conclusion one for sure, and they make it rather probable that conclusion one is going to be true, right? More likely than not, after you've seen 1,000 swans, you're going to see another white one, especially if you live very far away from Australia, and there's no good zoos that have brought black swans from Australia, right? And hundreds of years ago in the UK, that would have been the case. However, in the end, one instance of a not white swan makes a problem for the argument to conclusion number two here, right? Premise one and premise two, they do seem to, like, at least for that situation, make conclusion number two here probable, seeming probable, but in the end, it's not. It's false. It's incorrect. Each of these premises can be true while the conclusion is still false. And then, actually taking everything on the whole, in the end, that conclusion just isn't actually that probable, given what we now know about biology and how different kinds of species can do different kinds of things in different places, right? Like you can have the same origin, right? So you have swans and then they diverge in a certain way, and the ones that live over here are going to look different than the ones that live over here because, different predators, different species, etc. Now, inductive arguments can, like deductive arguments, can be good or bad in different ways, right? A deductive argument, like I said earlier, is good if it's valid, and it's good if it's sound. Being sound is the best way for a deductive argument to be, but it's a deductive argument can be good if it's valid. Similarly, inductive arguments are good if they are strong, and best if they are cogent. Now, a strong inductive argument, or strength with respect to an inductive argument, is the kind of thing where we take the premises and we assume that the premises, if true, make the conclusion probable. So here the idea is similar to validity, but we're not saying that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. We're saying that the premises, if they are true, actually make the conclusion probable, right? So we assume that the premises are true, right? Assuming that, like, I've seen 1,000 white swans, and that I've never seen a swan other than the color white. Well, that seems to make it probable, right? So if we assume that that's true, because ultimately it's not true, right? I haven't actually probably seen 1,000 swans in my life. I have no idea how many swans I've seen. But if we assume that it's true, right? Assuming that I've seen 1,000 swans that have all been white, then it seems plausible to believe that the next one I see is going to be white as well. And so the idea here is that would be a strong inductive argument, because the premises, on the assumption that they're true, seem to make the conclusion probable. They make the conclusion more likely than not. Otherwise, the argument would be a weak one. A weak inductive argument is the kind of argument where the premises maybe support the conclusion a little bit, but they don't make it more probable than not. So sometimes, ultimately, evidence for a conclusion is just weak evidence, right? Sometimes these arguments are really bad. Like, it's possible to have an inductive argument that's just a bad one because ultimately the premises don't make the conclusion probable at all. That happens when you have like premises that have nothing to do with the conclusion, right? But in most cases, people are trying to give good arguments where the premises are relevant to the conclusion. And in those kinds of cases, somebody might give evidence for a conclusion, but it's weak evidence because it's just like a little bit of extra evidence, right? If I said, oh, I saw one swan and it was white, so the next swan that I see is also going to be white. Well, seeing one white swan is a little bit of evidence for believing that the next swan you'll see is white, but it's not a lot. It's not enough, right? It's too small of a sample size. So it's kind of weak evidence. It offers some reason for thinking, but it doesn't offer enough reason for thinking that it's more probable than not. Whereas strong evidence does make something more likely than not. Now, here's an example of a strong inductive argument. I have liked every flavor of ice cream that I have ever tried. That's the premise. Conclusion. So I will like the next flavor of ice cream that I try. Now, this is, of course, strong support, right? The premise, if true, makes it seem more likely than not that I'm going to like the next kind of ice cream I try, probably because I just like ice cream, right? But the conclusion isn't guaranteed, right? There could always be that like Harry Potter, Bertie Bott's every flavored beans ice cream where they're like, we're going to play a joke and make grass flavored ice cream. Like, it could be terrible, right? But if that happened, I might not enjoy the ice cream, even if I would probably try it, right? So the conclusion isn't guaranteed here, but likelihood is that I'm gonna just try some new Ben and Jerry's flavor that I've never had before, and it's gonna be great, all right? So here we have a strong inductive argument because the conclusion is made probable by the premise. The premise offers strong support for the conclusion. But ultimately, this argument is the premise is false, and the conclusion is, So ultimately, this argument, while being strong, isn't cogent because I don't like mint ice cream. And cogency, the cogency of an inductive argument, is akin to what I called soundness for deductive arguments. Cogency is when you have a strong inductive argument, that is, the premises actually support that the conclusion is true. They make the conclusion more likely than not, and the premises are true. In a cogent argument, we've got sort of both. We've got good premises that are true, and we know that the conclusion is made more probable than by the premises. So a strong inductive argument that has untrue premises is going to be an uncogent argument, right? Where the premises are false, but it's still the case that the conclusion is made more probable by the premises. Now, of course, the best kind of inductive argument is a cogent one, again, because it is strong and it has true premises. But ultimately, again, remember, even in a cogent inductive argument, the conclusion is still not guaranteed. The conclusion is more probable than not, given the truth of the premises, but sometimes cogent arguments that have probabilities, it's still, it's like, I don't know, think about where you last parked your car. Well, likelihood is that it's still going to be there, right? It's going to be right where you parked it. That's how, the premises are like, every day I park my car over here. It's never been towed, right? I've paid all of my parking tickets in the past. I locked my car door, so it's hard. It'd be hard for someone to steal it, etc. Right? You have all these premises that support the conclusion, so it's like a strong argument, and it's cogent because all of the premises are true. But it could still be the case, that your car got stolen and you just didn't know it, right? So, it could be that the argument fails because the conclusion isn't guaranteed here, even though the argument is ultimately cogent. And that, in the end, is kind of what makes the difference between a good inductive argument and a good deductive argument. Deductive arguments, when a deductive argument is sound, the conclusion has to be true also. Whereas for an inductive argument, the inductive argument can be cogent, and still somehow the conclusion could fail to be true. All right, so now we've also gotten through the discussion of inductive arguments and what it is for an inductive argument to be strong and what it is for an inductive argument to be cogent. Now we can talk about persuasiveness and what it is for an argument to be more or less persuasive. Now there are lots of different reasons, both good and bad, that an argument could be persuasive, right? Someone might speak with authority. They might have like a really nice voice, right? You might believe them in the past. They might be a kind of authority figure. But the most important aspect of the persuasiveness of an argument is, of course, whether or not the argument is true, right? And so ultimately, one good reason, the best thing to do in looking for an argument to be persuasive is to think about whether or not the argument is deductively sound or inductively cogent, right? So of course, if an argument is deductively sound, then the premises are true and the argument is valid, which means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. So that's a great reason for believing that the argument is true, and so it should be persuasive. Similarly, an inductive argument that's cogent is going to have true premises and it's going to be inductively strong. So if it's inductively strong, then the premises make the conclusion more likely than not. And so, true premises and the premises make the conclusion likely. Cool. Good reason for believing it. Well, now it seems like you should be persuaded. If you can identify an argument as a good one, then it seems like you should believe it, right? And if you don't believe it sort of outright, once you've recognized that it's a good argument, then you're going to need a reason to deny the belief in the conclusion of the argument, right? And to deny a good argument, you are either going to have to think that one of the premises is false, that is, either deny that a deductive argument is sound or deny that an inductive argument is cogent, or you're going to have some other reason for thinking that the conclusion isn't actually likely in the case of an inductive argument. So again, in order to say, like, if you see an argument and you're like, yep, that's a good argument, it's valid, and but then you want to say, no, but I don't believe the conclusion. Well, if it's a deductive argument, then you're going to have to figure out which of the premises you want to say is not correct. If it's an inductive argument, you have two options. You can say that one of the premises is actually not correct, or you can disagree with one of the premises, or you can say something else that you believe that ultimately leads you to think that the conclusion isn't likely. Of course, when we come across a good argument and it has a good conclusion, and we accept that it's a good argument, then we need to fit that conclusion into our web of beliefs, right? You have a lot of different beliefs, and all of your beliefs kind of support one another in some way or another. And ultimately, your beliefs are just those kinds of claims that you would judge to be true. Sometimes when we, come across a piece of information, we can't actually fully commit to the truth of it, because we see it and we're like, well, yeah, that seems like it's probably true, but I can't, go do the science right now, or I can't, look it up. I don't have access to Google, or or just nobody knows for sure, right? Now, in those cases, when you can't fully commit to the truth of something, but you can be sort of more confident than not in the claim, then you have what's called a credence. And so beliefs and credences are different ways of being committed to the truth of some bit of information or some judgment, right? When you judge outright that some claim is true, then you believe it. and then hopefully, you fit it in with your other beliefs, and you make sure that you don't have any conflicting beliefs, right? Like, you don't want to come to believe that, that Jesus is the Son of God, but then also believe that God doesn't exist, right? Like, that would be a conflict, right? You got to give one of those things up. um, but when you come to believe, when you're confronted with certain information, and you're not 100% sure of it, right? Like, I don't know, let's take another biblical example. Moses parted the Red Sea, right? Now that seems like an extreme thing that could have happened. But maybe, you're like, yeah, like, you go and you do a bunch of research, and you find out that the Red Sea works in this one particular way, and that when the wind blows at a certain angle, it could have been that, there was like this way in the Red Sea that someone could walk through. So you're like, maybe it wasn't Moses, but the Red Sea did part. Well, in that case, you could be like, okay, yeah, that seems like it could have happened, but I can't fully commit to the truth of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be confident that it was true, but not take a full commitment. In that case, you have what is called a credence, and then the credence, it's hard to put a number on it, but usually what with the way that people like to think about it, philosophers and particularly epistemologists, people that study knowledge for a living, they say that your credence is more than 50% when you are confident that something is true without outright believing the claim. Moving over now to think about bad persuasive arguments, there's so many different ways that arguments can be bad and thereby unpersuasive. Most of the arguments that you probably come across in your day-to-day life are in some way bad, and we need to be like vigilant, and like some of these bad arguments can still be persuasive for bad reasons, and we need to be vigilant in order to sort of be able to spot these reasons so that we can know when to reject the argument. Being able to root out bad arguments, like ones that look persuasive but ultimately shouldn't be, is just part of what it is to have a good kind of mental hygiene, right? To have like a bunch of good beliefs in your head, right? Now, obviously, if an argument has a false premise or the conclusion is false, then the argument is bad. But that you can't always spot that. And then there are other reasons for thinking arguments are bad, right? So sometimes arguments are bad because they aren't structured correctly. So they're invalid arguments, and we'll talk more at length what kinds of arguments are, arguments that are trying to be deductive in form, but they turn out to be poorly structured, and so they're actually invalid. In lots of these cases, ultimately, this is just the kind of case where the premises and the conclusion don't have the right kind of relationship to one another. And in those cases, you just have a bad argument that shouldn't be persuasive. Some kinds of arguments, don't lend probability or plausibility to their conclusions, right? The premises simply do not support the conclusion in the right way. Sometimes there are arguments where the premises are off topic, and you'll see that happen a lot when we talk about certain kinds of fallacies. And then some arguments, they ultimately leave out premises in order to make themselves look more plausible. This is called an implicit premise or an enthymeme. It's the kind of argument that leaves something out, where it's usually easy to fix the argument to add the premise back in, but usually the reason that the person left the premise out is because it's the premise that's the stinker. It's the premise that's the least plausible in the end. Fallacies are one, if not most, of the forms of bad reasoning. Fallacies are often what is being committed. You're committing a fallacy when you're making an argument that is unpersuasive. Almost all bad arguments commit some kind of fallacy. And fallacies can ultimately be distinguished into two different camps. We have formal fallacies, which are the fallacies of deductive reasoning and ultimately result in arguments that are invalid. And then we have informal fallacies. These fallacies are fallacies of inductive reasoning, fallacies of relevance, fallacies of bias, fallacies of sample size. There's a huge number of informal fallacies, which are just kind of bad ways of reasoning, whereas formal fallacies are poorly structured arguments that just don't work because you didn't put them together correctly. Formal fallacies are, again, fallacies of deductive reasoning, and we'll talk more about these in the lecture on deductive reasoning. And the example, here's just a really simple example here, right? All men are mortal, Felix is mortal, therefore Felix is a man. This argument is, if you look closely, simply badly put together, right? If we said Felix is a man, then it would the conclusion that Felix is a mortal might follow. Right, that would be a valid argument, even if Felix ultimately turns out to not be a man, he's a cat. But the way that this current argument is structured is highly problematic, right? All men are mortal, Felix is mortal, therefore Felix is a man. That doesn't make sense, right? Because in this case, the premises are actually true, supposing Felix is a cat. But that it doesn't follow then that Felix is a man. And these fallacies can ultimately be pretty easily spotted once you are good at spotting whether or not something is valid or invalid. And that's something that we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about, because it really is ultimately helpful sort of in your reading skills and in your argumentative writing to be able to spot when an argument is committing a deductive fallacy. Informal fallacies, like inductive arguments, are way more common, and they really do, more often than not, accompany inductive arguments. So here's like a really simple example of an informal fallacy. Donald Trump said that the vaccines aren't effective. Only effective vaccines are worth the risk, therefore I probably shouldn't take the vaccine. Well, in this case, the reason that this would be an informal fallacy is that this is the fallacy of what's called appeal to authority. And appeal to authority, I mean, so obviously authorities are correct. Like, you know, if you're asking a doctor for a medical opinion, that's probably a good authority. But Donald Trump isn't a good authority on vaccine effectiveness, right? He's not a doctor. I mean, if Donald Trump was saying, my doctor said that the vaccine wasn't effective, that's a different thing. But if he just says, no, the vaccines aren't effective, well, that's a problem. He's the wrong kind of authority in this case. And so the argument is bad. Why? Because the premise, as it stands, even if it's true, doesn't actually support the conclusion, because it's irrelevant what Donald Trump thinks to whether or not you should actually take the vaccine, because he's the wrong kind of authority in this case. In the next few lectures, we're going to be covering deductive argument forms and how they work, and kind of aspects of formal thinking, like how to sort of formalize arguments and make them, basically it turns arguments into a kind of math that's really simple and super straightforward, and then, you know, makes it easy and helpful for thinking. We'll talk about the formal fallacies when talking about deductive arguments. Then we'll talk about inductive arguments and how they work, as well as the informal fallacies.